today we're going to be joined by one of the best independent journalists out there, Sam Husseini. Now, you may recognize Sam as someone who asks valuable and tough questions during the State Department press conferences. Let me just actually play this clip for you of the last time Sam was allowed to ask a question. Watch this.
You just said you're for a durable peace and security, and you want Israel to abide by international law. I'm going to pick up where I left off yesterday. Does the U.S. recognize the Fourth Geneva Convention as applying to Gaza and the West Bank?
Sam, I'm not going to get into the specifics of the legal aspects of this. I would have to double check for you. But what I will just say is that we have.
I don't want to take up a lot of time if we're going to just repeat.
We can,
no. I mean, I'd like to move on if you're just going to repeat. It has been long-standing U.S. policy that the Fourth Geneva Convention does apply. Indeed, if the Fourth Geneva Convention doesn't apply, it's not clear to me what legal constraints there are on Israel. The Hansel memo was issued by Cyrus Vance when he was Secretary of State. That was U.S. policy. That's been U.S. policy. Pompeo seems to have said, we're not going to abide by this. Has this State Department, has the Biden-Blinken State Department effectively abrogated decades of U.S. policy and adopted the Pompeo policy on this question?
I'm not sure what you're referring to, but
okay. The Hansel memo is.
I understand what the Hansel memo is, but
you
I'm
do.
asking
Okay.
what your question.
Does it still apply? Does this State Department still abide by the Hansel
We
memo?
have had no change in policy as it relates to the Hansel memo, which is something that Matt has spoken to a number of months ago as well. But let me just reiterate, Sam, that this we have. From the forefront of this conflict, we have talked about very clearly the need for ensuring that this military operation is conducted in accordance with international law. That's something we continue to talk about.
You won't say that you
abide by that today.
But which law? Which law? The Fourth Geneva Convention or not?
Go ahead, Alex.
Which law? It's a free fire zone if you're not going to abide by the Fourth Geneva Convention. Which law? You're creating the legal construct
Sam, we've taken two. If you're going to interrupt your colleagues, I'm going to ask you to leave.
No, I'm interrupting you.
The rest of the room has questions that they would like to get to.
I'm sure they do,
I've taken your question every day of this week.
Thank you.
Alex, please go ahead.
I just haven't gotten an answer.
Please go ahead, Alex.
I want to push on the corridor issue.
Sure.
I'm not interrupting him. I'm interrupting you. That was the last time that he was invited to ask a question. And so it might be a while before he's allowed to ask another one. Sam has been a longtime critic of Israel and the U.S.-Israeli relationship. I believe his parents, or at least one of his parents, are Palestinian Christians who fled after the Nakba. Since the beginning of the war on Gaza, he wrote extensively about the possibility of a country invoking the Genocide Convention against Israel. And of course, South Africa ended up doing so. He was one of the first at the time pointing out the lies that led us into the Iraq war back over 20 years ago now. He doesn't only cover foreign policy. He was one of the first journalists to raise the possibility of lab origins of COVID, writing several pieces in 2020, including one of the first takedowns of Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance. He also co-wrote an in-depth investigation of possible origins of Ebola 2014, which implicates many of the same scientists who dismissed lab origins of COVID like Gary and Anderson. Sam Husseini, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Kim.
It's great to have you on. I've been following your work for a while, and I've seen a lot of your the questions that you sometimes get to ask at the State Department. You're always asking the really good questions, and they never seem to answer them. I just want to start off with that because we just played the clip, and it just must be absolutely frustrating. How does it even work in there? Because now they're not asking. Since then you have not been picked on for any questions, right?
I've been picked on in a way, but they haven't called on me for any to ask any questions since then. I've gone there periodically, and I'll spend the entire 45 minutes or an hour with my hand raised. Every time they go to a question, and they won't call on me. Sometimes they actually call on people sitting next to me just to sort of taunt me. But I play by the journalistic rules. I just have a very aggressive form of journalism that, in a sense, it dovetails with the legal aspects of this. It's almost I feel like I'm doing a first run of a prosecution case.
Yeah.
That is, that they're a criminal suspect, and I'm questioning them about a case, and that's kind of unusual, and they don't like it.
Well, you know what I think bothers many of us is that they're allowed to pick and choose who they call on.
Right.
That it's not somehow random or, like draw a name out of a hat. It seems like that would be more fair, but instead they get to pick the people who they know are going to ask them the softball questions.
Largely, I mean, they'll occasionally call on people who ask some critical questions, but in a very ginger, polite, deferential manner, generally speaking. And often not the toughest question that needs to be asked. And they have a group of favorites that people who used to work for USAID, things like that. So they're sort of their bailout. So when they want to, on those rare occasions when they do call on me, they will very quickly go to one of them who will proceed to try to cut me off.
How often are you in these briefings?
Well, I haven't gone a great deal lately because they stopped calling on me, and I have, I got into the whole, invoking the Genocide Convention, so that took up a lot of, I felt my time was being properly used elsewhere,
right.
And also I had a very bad case of bronchitis, and I mean, I've gone to, I would say, at least 10 of them since they last didn't call on me, maybe half a dozen, but it's obvious that their policy is to not call on me. So my choice is, either start hollering out questions and see how that goes. And they have threatened, even when I've just followed up aggressively, they've threatened to kick me out. So I don't know what's going to happen if I go down that road, but that's a possibility.
Yeah, it's extremely frustrating that it's like pick and choose their favorites. It really should not be that way. And I don't know if there's any discussion on ever fixing that or making it more random.
Yeah, you're right. And they'll often, like I said, that they have their favorites. They sometimes call on them like repeatedly during the same news conference with multiple follow-ups. So they'll have, they'll call on a journalist and they'll have 3 follow-ups, and then they'll call on him later on in the course of in the same news conference. So
this is why it's so difficult to make any change. I mean, it feels like when they're picking and choosing the journalists they like and the outlets that they like, when they're also just even in Congress, when I think about these newbies getting in Congress and they think they're going to make a bunch of change, but ultimately the rules are that they get kind of blacklisted from any committees or not able to, so we just can't even seem to make any effective change because anybody who's an outsider just gets cut out in one way or another.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you do have some tough questions. I mean, I was kind of disappointed with him at the beginning of the, in October. Matt Lee of the AP sometimes asks tough questions, but he was very soft on them during the first month or two. So that there are some people on the inside that do some interesting.
Yeah.
But I think you're absolutely right. There are so many layers of control of anyone who might pose a threat to the dominant narrative.
Yeah, just really ridiculous. How long have you been in Washington, D.C.?
Too long, about 25 years.
25 years.
Yeah.
And covering a variety of things during this whole time?
Yeah, absolutely. Most of that time I've been with a nonprofit with a small office at the press club. And the best part of my job was getting into news conferences and asking tough questions. I've sort of tried to do that as much as possible.
Was there ever a point, I mean, you've been there, you said 25 years. So since the Iraq War is when you were really questioning them. And did they treat you before then? Did they treat you the same way during the Iraq War when were you asking them questions and they were blacklisting you a bit?
I wasn't trying to get into the State Department at that point. I mean, basically, I used to get on cable, in the late 90s. I was kind of a go-to critic of U.S. Iraq policy during the late 90s up until 9/11. And then I got totally iced out of all media structures and so on. The rules of the press club are, generally speaking, I'm a member of the press club and I'm able to get in there and ask questions, generally speaking, although when the Arab uprisings happened, I asked an aggressive question of the Saudi ambassador and they attempted to suspend me from the press.
What did you ask?
I asked what the legitimacy of the Saudi regime was, and I was insistent upon it.
Well, what is the legitimacy of this monarchy?
They have weapons and money is the legitimacy
Right.
of the Saudi regime.
Yeah.
And so the executive director of the press club attempted to suspend me. The ethics committee overruled him when they looked into the matter. So I'm sort of a gadfly in those quarters, but I'm able to do my work when I really need to.
Speaking of the Saudis, isn't it interesting that the United States is always going around saying we're spreading democracy? We do everything for democracy, right? The reason why the Saudis are still in power as one of the only monarchies in the world, one of the only true monarchies left, is because of the United States. I mean, we have an agreement to secure them and to keep them safe and to keep them in power so that we could continue doing the deals that we do with oil and dollar exchange with oil and whatnot. But here we are, protecting a true monarchy where there's no democracy for the Saudi people. But we're all about democracy and spreading democracy and freeing people from tyranny.
Yeah. I mean, the U.S. in the Middle East, generally speaking, has stitched up the region, the U.S. establishment, through multiple administrations, including Trump and Biden. Every country that could have posed a challenge has been decimated.
Yeah.
Iraq, Syria, Libya, and all of especially the monarchies, are basically toadies of the United States. And will toe the line. And, occasional rhetoric like what we heard from King Abdullah of Jordan recently. But generally speaking, they will go along. And I think that's why you've seen the emergence of these, subnational, the so-called Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah. They are the ones who are manifesting popular opinion because the governments have been either so crushed and weakened or bought out and effectively enslaving each of those countries.
Yeah, it's Egypt is an interesting one, isn't it? That they're the second largest recipient. I mean, now maybe things have changed with Ukraine, but for the longest time, Israel was the number one recipient of U.S. aid, and Egypt was right behind them.
Correct.
And that seemed to be, what was the reason for that, do you think?
Well, basically, Egypt signed the Camp David agreement, which basically was the first step in telling the Palestinians, you're on your own.
Yeah.
The Arab consensus prior to that was that no Arab country would normalize relations with Israel until Israel treated the Palestinians fairly and gave them a permanent, fair settlement. Israel wouldn't do that. Egypt signed the agreement. It was expelled from the Arab League and effectively became a client state of the United States.
Yeah.
And that was also largely the end of, a vibrant, non-aligned movement in the global South. I think that's the reason for it. And since then you had, the U.S. dominating, Morsi, for example, was elected president in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings, and the U.S. effectively helped push him out. So again, further isolating the Palestinians.
Right. I mean, it just seemed to be a strategic move towards getting Israel getting what Israel wants.
Correct.
Seemed to be the strategic move of getting in bed with Egypt in that way. I mean,
Absolutely.
When people find out that Egypt is the second largest recipient of U.S. aid, people think, why? What's the reason for that? Well, it's strategy for Israel. Everything's being done for Israel. I mean, it's insane that why don't we just name Israel the 51st state already? I mean, just get it over with, right? Make them part of the United States.
Yeah, the old joke is then that we would only have 2 senators if we did that.
Right.
But yeah, the U.S.-Israel relationship to me is the manifestation of the worst aspects of settler colonialism that effectively continues. And that's why it needs to be confronted as a matter of global concern.
It does seem to be maybe the last of that style of settler colonialism.
Correct.
There's a new kind of style that, just like there's new warfare, right? We kind of morph into this into a new way rather than boots on the ground. Then it kind of morphed into drone warfare, which is then Now we just use other people's bodies.